Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Let's dive right into a critical question that honestly frustrates modern executives everywhere. Today, we're looking at the Intelligent Organization Framework, specifically Domain 1, Capability 4, which is entirely focused on risk. But before we get into the mechanics of it all, we really need to address the elephant in the room regarding how most organizations actually view risk in the real world. So tell me if this sounds familiar. Is risk just the department that says no? For years, we've kind of thought of risk as this inevitable organizational bottleneck. It's that team you go to right before a big launch, only to have your project delayed or worse, completely derailed. But the source material for the IO framework completely shatters this assumption. They argue that viewing risk as the department of no is actually a massive strategic failure, and one that creates totally avoidable harm. I absolutely love this quote. Risk is the organization's ability to protect trust while moving forward. It brilliantly illustrates this massive paradigm shift. Good risk does not stop progress. Instead, it acts as a proactive enabler for safe speed. It's really not about making your organization less ambitious. It is about making that ambition safer, clearer, and far more trusted. Risk is, quite literally, a trust protection capability. So today, we're exploring how the TIO framework reframes risk into a strategic asset. Our agenda covers the AI risk paradox, why trust is leadership's responsibility, defining the boundary line, the 5 core behaviors, and proving trust with evidence. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the AI risk paradox. Right now, we are smack in the middle of the AI risk paradox. On one hand, AI is easier to access than ever before. Tools are spreading like wildfire, employees are experimenting on their own, and vendors are just embedding AI into all your existing systems. But then there's the counterweight, right? Absorbing this technology safely, productively, and at scale remains incredibly elusive. The issue isn't really whether AI matters anymore. The reality is that standing still is just not an option. But moving recklessly completely destroys trust. Moving on to Section 2. Trust is leadership's responsibility. To actually solve this paradox, leaders absolutely have to own the trust posture of the entire organization. Protecting trust is not some specialist problem you can just delegate away. Notice how risk anchors directly within the TIO continuous operating sequence. This is the core logic of the leadership domain, and it flows like this. Strategy chooses where the organization is going. Fluency informs those choices with good judgment. Governance decides the rules and decision rights. Risk protects trust, and transformation mobilizes the enterprise to act. These aren't isolated tasks. They are a continuous engine. If you try to skip risk, you simply cannot confidently unleash your transformation. If we zoom in on Capability 4, here's the formal definition. Risk is the organization's ability to identify, assess, manage, and monitor exposures created by new tech and new ways of working. And it's super important to note here, while AI is often where this need shows up first, the capability itself is way broader. It covers automation, data, vendors, operating changes, and workforce impact. Risk is a leadership discipline supported by specialists. It is not a function that leaders can just ignore or outsource completely. Section 3, defining the boundary line. So understanding exactly where risk begins and ends requires a firm boundary. Otherwise, things get messy. We need to cleanly separate the mechanics here. Governance sets the rules. They decide who can approve, stop, escalate, or review work. Risk, on the other hand, actively spots the vulnerabilities. Risk identifies what could go wrong, how serious it is, what controls are needed, and ultimately, whether public and organizational trust is actually protected. Basically, governance builds the rulebook, risk actively ensures the safeguards are genuinely in place. Section 4, the 5 core behaviors. Okay, let's get into the operational mechanics and see how this builds a continuous engine for safe AI adoption. How does a team actually do risk in this framework? Well, they do it through these 5 core behaviors. And look, these aren't just one-off checklist items. They act like pistons in an engine. First, you identify where exposure might exist across data, security, legal, or operations. Second, you assess the severity and the business impact. Third, you protect by defining the controls, the safeguards, and the human oversight needed. Fourth, you escalate serious risks and residual risk decisions to accountable leaders. And finally, you learn by using incidents, exceptions, and audits to improve future rules. It's a continuous loop of protection. And honestly, the beautiful thing here is that this doesn't have to start with some massive, complicated manual. By simply asking these three fundamental plain English questions before a project scales, risk becomes built right into the path from idea to decision. It stops arriving as a late-stage objection. The goal is to ask better questions early on. What could go wrong? Who could be affected? What protection is needed? Answer those, and you can define controls, accept residual risk deliberately, and learn before trust is ever damaged. Section 5. Proving trust with evidence. Now, philosophical shifts are great, but they absolutely must be grounded in concrete reality. We can talk about protecting trust all day long, but how do we prove this capability is actually active and working? Well, the TIO framework demands these three specific evidence rules. To prove risk exists, you can't just point to a DESTI binder on a shelf. You need concrete artifacts. You need an active risk register with named owners. You need a documented risk assessment process for AI use cases, automation, and vendors. And you need an approved escalation path for issues that exceed agreed thresholds. Remember, you score evidence, not aspiration. If the evidence is missing, the capability does not meaningfully exist. When you measure this mandate using TIO's maturity scale, the contrast is incredibly stark. Down at level 0, the capability is pretty much absent. Risk is invisible or discovered only after the harm has already occurred. But look up at level 5, the optimized state. At this stage, risk continuously improves. Weak risk causes harm and bogs you down, but optimized risk actually speeds up the enterprise. Why? Because trust protection is built directly into how work changes. When you have adaptive controls and fast risk routing, the business can confidently push boundaries. Which brings us to the core thesis of this entire capability. Trust is not protected by caution alone. Trust is protected by disciplined leadership. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to ask yourself a question. Is your organization merely being cautious and letting risk act as a department of no? Or do you actually have the disciplined leadership engine, the boundaries, and the hard evidence required to safely unleash your ambition? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.